so let's take a look at part 3. Okay, stay awake everybody, I'm turning the lights down. Okay, so obviously, one of the reasons why I brought it up first thing is it is a topic I want to discuss today. In history, what is the idea of bias? So I'm going to present 3 classic historical biases. The first one is called the topic choice bias, okay? When a historian decides to study something, they choose a topic. Well, then that choice of topic could literally bias their perspective as they study it. They may ask or not ask questions influenced by the topic that they're studying. Second, and we're going to go into a little more detail in a second. Confirmation bias. This showed up when we talked about our study of human sciences as well. That you may be tempted to only seek out evidence to confirm your hypothesis and not seek out evidence against your hypothesis or counter evidence. And then the national bias. This one is especially strong in history, this sense of nationality that when you're studying the history of your own country, you may be biased in terms of the way you look at your own country. 1814. Sure. There we go. Okay, so let's take a look at this responses here, okay? In topic bias, historians' choice may be, of course, influenced by the society they grow up in, right? And that might reduce your ability to study it objectively. You might choose a topic based on the society you grew up in. Similarly, in response to confirmation bias, we know, we've already talked about it, that history is a selection. It's a selection of a selection. And a bad historian may constantly select evidence from historical evidence that confirms what they think. Oh, this is what caused that war. And look at this evidence and look at this evidence. But if you think like a natural scientist, like a biologist or a chemist, very often what they try to do is they try to disprove their own theory. And a good historian tries the same thing. They try to find evidence that might actually disprove their own theory, and if they can't find it, that strengthens their own sort of hypothesis there. And then again, with national bias, with the idea of nationalism, okay? This, of course, is another bias that is very difficult to overcome. Okay? We want people to have pride in their own country, but as well, or it might be the opposite as well. Someone might be very against a certain country, and as a result, it's difficult to do that. So the sort of solution to that is looking at histories from both perspectives, sort of from all perspectives, from perspectives outside of your own national bias. Okay. All right, so there's just a basic look at biases in history. So today let's take a look at another approach to history known as the pluralistic approach. Okay, so there's no way to get around bias. There's no easy way to get around it. We try to reduce bias as much as we can. But history has also been used for propaganda. We talked about that at the beginning of this unit. So it's no surprise that bias is promoted in terms of propaganda. So should history books not just reflect the experiences of like the elite people in history, but also poor, also women, also minorities? We talked about that early on, that there is no history of a Roman slave, or there's no history of a peasant in medieval Europe for several reasons, okay? Most notably that history is generally written about the so-called great people in history, okay? So maybe the pluralist approach would say that we shouldn't talk about a single history of a country, but we should talk about histories, like there are multiple views of the same sort of point in history. That there is a multitude approach, or a cubist would be sort of an artistic way to put it, approach to looking at history. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean that we just say that there's no truth in history, that everyone has their own truth. But this idea that in history we can have multiple truths of the same sort of point in history. This is again problematic. It's difficult to have multiple histories of the same event that might be telling different stories. And then which one do we kind of go with? Which one do we believe in terms of the way we're looking at history? Well, this is another question of knowledge, right? Like, how do we view knowledge will be kind of a perspective of how we view history. It doesn't take far to look at this in a historical perspective. On the wall behind some of you over there is a picture of Louis Riel. What's everyone's opinion of Louis Riel? Okay? Some people view the perspective of Louis Riel in a positive way as an agent of change in the province of Manitoba, and others see him in a different light. I mean, he was hung, right, for so-called treason against the province. So the perspectives are pluralist. There are different perspectives there. And the way you view knowledge and the way you kind of view that approach is important to the way you shape your perspective of that particular person. Okay? Okay. But at a basic historical level, we have to make a conclusion. Did event X occur or not occur? Did Louis Riel exist or not exist? We have to at least make that kind of a perspective approach. So we may say, yeah, he existed. Okay? Can we do that with all of history? For example, did Socrates exist? There's a historical question as to whether Socrates actually existed as a philosopher. Some people say he was just an invention of Plato to just use him in terms of his writings. Because it's so far away, there's no necessary historical evidence to actually sort of prove his existence. So at some point, we may have to just make a knowledge claim, sure, he existed. And then we move forward from that in terms of our study. Okay? Okay. Anybody can make history. Only a great man can write it. So let's look at some of these historical theories. So history is not just about explaining that event X occurred, but it's also about it's not just about describing it, but also trying to make explanations for it, trying to make sense of historical events. This is the study of things like causes of things in history. But this is really complex in history. It's not so simple. It's a matter of studying evidence, sure, but it's also a matter of making conjectures as to which way things go. There's rarely a single cause, right? If I said, what's the cause of World War I? Some people might argue that it was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. But others would say, no, it was way more complex than that. It was a powder keg waiting to erupt. Some would argue that it's stuff beyond what we normally think of in history. Okay? So that's what I'm going to try to look at now. What's beyond the normal in terms of historical study? So the first one I'm going to look at is this idea of geography. There's a historian named Jared Diamond who argues that geography is the most important factor in a country's history. Your country's geography. Okay? Now I'll ask you that about Canada. You think about Canada's geography. We have access to both oceans. Okay? We have access to the North Pole. We have a wide variety of geographical sort of conditions across Canada, from prairies to mountainous regions, from cold areas to warmer areas. I don't want to say hot areas, but warmer areas. We tend to, if you've ever looked at the map of Canada's population, we all tend to clutter near the bottom, right near the border to the United States, and even that maybe is an influence on our history. The fact that we border the United States, the largest unprotected border in the world, exists within Canada and the United States. Do you think that affected our history, the way our geography is set up? I would challenge anyone who says no to that question. The real question is, how many people in this room think it's the most important factor in Canada's history? No hands go up.
Well, it's kind of hard because we haven't actually studied
the history of Canada. Did you not get your grade 11 credit? Okay, I know. I'm assuming. Yeah, I was hoping that's what you weren't going to say. Yeah.
No, just we haven't studied actual what affects history, that kind of thing.
Well, sure we have. That's what we've been doing now, and you've already taken history, and I'm asking your opinion, which is really important, David. Okay, so if it's not geography, what is the most important factor controlling Canadian history? Is it politics? Is it racial issues? Is it economics? What would you say is the factor in... Really? Yes. Okay, be more specific. What about people? That's a pretty open term. Like people drive the history of Canada. Okay. So like great people then? Anyone. Okay. So someone in this room can affect the history of Canada in a major way, depending on what they do. Politics? Politics people. There's a word for that, actually. Politicians. What else? Come on. What else affects Canada's history? So we have people, some would argue politicians, weather, natural disasters. How many, Canada's not, well, there are natural disasters in Canada. Floods, for example, is a big one. Droughts are a big one.
Small types of hurricanes.
Yeah, a few tornadoes. Certainly the cold is a natural disaster, yes. Ah, the history of other countries. Some might argue that the history of the United States is a major influence on Canadian history. Where would you rank geography on the list? Would you put it in the top 5 of things that influence Canada? Yeah? Because Jared Diamond would argue with you that it's number 1. And he would argue that for pretty much every country. You take some countries like that are landlocked, that have no access to oceans or streets, that basically they are surrounded by other countries. That could certainly affect their history, right? The fact that, I mean, we talked about how the United States affects our country, but we can kind of get away from the United States if we need to go to another country. We don't have to go through the United States to get to, say, Europe. We can go through the ocean. But if you are a country that is surrounded by other countries, I would think you better get along with those countries or you're going to be in some sort of problem there, okay? What about countries that are more southern and have a more southern, closer to the equator geography? Obviously, they're going to be warmer. That's going to affect their history? It might, right? What about countries that in their geography have no natural resources? Living in Canada, we take for granted that we have access to farming and oil and things like that. But there are certainly countries that have little to no natural resources. So how do they build an economy off that? What do they use? Can anyone think of an example of a country that has little to no natural resources? I could tell that only a few of you study history in this class. Wow, you guys. You don't have to necessarily name the country, but what area of the world would have little to no natural resources? The Middle East? Not all of the Middle East has oil. Okay. Areas of Africa as well have little natural resource in that area. What about places like Siberia, northern Russia, right? Even northern Canada, depending on what the natural resource is. I mean, even looking at the Alberta oil sands, it could be potentially a huge natural resource. Is it? Is it a resource for us right now? Yeah. So are we getting tons of oil out of the oil sands right now? Well, we don't really have the technology yet to kind of pull it out without causing huge environmental problems. So even though there is more oil there than in any other place in the world, right? So maybe you guys will become the scientists that will actually find the way to do that. Okay, I'm going to leave this. It seems like you guys are struggling with this one. Okay. Here's another perspective. I think some of you have heard of it. The idea of the great person theory. So in this theory, it would say that history is driven by individuals. As a matter of fact, a historian named Taylor argued that you can look at the history of Europe if by just looking at 3 individuals. Napoleon, Bismarck, and Lenin. They said that if you study just these 3 individuals, you'll have a good grasp of the history of Europe. Okay? What this also implies, if you fall into this theory, that if those individuals did not exist, the history would be radically changed. Right? So if you changed something about these 3 individuals, the history of that area would radically change. So this kind of leads back to a discussion we had back in the arts unit, with the idea of these people that shape the course of this sort of area of knowledge. So if Newton never existed, would someone else have come up with the laws of gravity? And if Shakespeare never existed, would someone else have written Hamlet? Okay? It's harder to argue for the second one. Okay? If Hitler never existed, would we be in a different history right now? Would history have changed? This would give credence to the theory that there are individuals who have a major influence on history. So this gives some strength to this theory. Okay, another historian said it's the history of thought, okay? Meaning that we can only understand people's actions by looking into their minds and trying to make sense of motives. What was Hitler's motives in the way he ran Nazi Germany, okay? He also stressed that in order to do this, we need to be empathetic with the individual. We need to understand their feelings. This almost kind of tends to bring us back to a little bit of what we talked about in the human sciences, this idea of trying to understand people from a psychological perspective, and as well something that could pull us back to last year's content. This idea of knowledge being something that we can delve into from an emotional perspective. But again, there are people who criticize this theory. They said that it's impossible to empathize with someone in history like an Adolf Hitler. We cannot ever necessarily be able to see that sort of perspective psychologically, okay? And that maybe even trying to do so is not a useful exercise. It's that we're using sort of a hindsight approach here to look back at history from that perspective. Okay, those are two historical perspectives. The geography perspective, the great person perspective. This one is another famous one, the economic determinism perspective. Made famous, of course, by Karl Marx. So what Marx said is that he felt the most important driving force in history is economics. Okay? His perspective was that the economics of an area drives history more than anything else. Into that, he would also put that technology is part of that. That economics and technology are the factors driving history of an area. Okay? And a lot of people buy into Marxism theories. Okay? So he would say things, for example, that if you have an economy set up on industry, if it's an industrial economy, it's set up a lot differently than an economy that's set up on a peasant economy, okay? And that things like great inventions, like the printing press, or the steam engine, or the computer, really drive historical change in areas. So the second a steam engine was introduced into a society, it had a major influence on its history, okay? How many of you feel Marx has something there with this economic determinism, okay? It's certainly been a theory that has held a lot of sort of potential there. That this idea that economy and technology drive historical sort of perspectives. Now, Karl Popper, a philosopher, went in to criticize Marx's theories. He stated that because Marx tended to kind of create big layers. He said that, you know what, I can actually predict history from the economy of a region. And that's what Popper criticized. He said, you know what? If you could predict the future, you could predict the details of new scientific discoveries. Like, oh, I can predict the future, and I know we're going to invent this at time X. And what Popper said was, well, if we can predict that, why not do it now and not the future? Okay? And so, again, it was a lot of debate back and forth about that, but what it did show is there are certainly some holes in Marx's theories that economies do drive history, but they may not be the only factor in there, okay? So those are three strong historical driving theories, okay? The great person theory, the geography theory, and the economics theory, okay? Those are three big theories that say this is sort of the cause of the history of an area. Okay, so the final one is a pure random perspective. Is history just random events? Is it not any major causes, but just history is just sort of some jagged thing? Any of you ever seen Forrest Gump, the movie Forrest Gump? Really? Only one of you seen Forrest Gump? Okay. What's one of the last lines in that movie? What does he talk about in that? With the feather floating up in the sky, what does that represent in that movie? Fate. He questions whether his fate over that movie was, as his mother said, sort of a drive of religion and like that we have a set path that we follow through our lives, or, as he says, as Lieutenant Dan said, who didn't love Lieutenant Dan, best character in the movie. Lieutenant Dan said that we're just sort of floating back and forth through our lives, going from one thing to another. And I would hope some of you have a similar philosophical perspective on your own lives. Am I on a path towards something? Or do I just take life as it comes and kind of shift my perspective as I move along? Well, if that's the case, then chance could be a driving force in history. Okay? Blaise Pascal, some of you may have heard of him from your math classes, said this. This was his dramatization of the role of chance. Pascal said, well, you know what? If Cleopatra had a slightly shorter nose, okay? So that's a random event. The character of Cleopatra in history, her nose was slightly smaller. Now, what do you guys know about Cleopatra in history? Let's be superficial for a second. Was she pretty? Apparently, according to history, she was gorgeous. Like, she was a beautiful individual, okay? And actually, what Blaise Pascal said was that if her nose was shorter, then Mark Antony might have found her less attractive because her nose was just, that's a little too short for me. And if Mark Antony found her less attractive, he wouldn't have fallen in love with her, as it says in history. Okay?
Just a reminder for all students, this morning in the front foyer, they're giving away free hot chocolate and free muffins. So make your way to the front foyer. Thank you.
If Mark Antony didn't fall in love with Cleopatra, he would have not had his fallout with Octavian. Do any of you studied this at all? Okay. Wow. Okay. Who became the future emperor Augustus? So if Mark Antony did not have a fallout with Augustus, okay, Rome would have remained a republic and not an empire. And if Rome remained a republic, it would have been able to resist the barbarian hordes and not fallen. So the Roman Empire would not have fallen, and as a result, the Europeans, the North Africans, the North Americans would all be under Roman rule right now. Right now, you guys would be sitting as part of the Roman Empire if Cleopatra's nose was shorter. Now, this is the Pascal's position. What logical fallacy did you guys study last year that fits into this? It's a poster up on the wall that you guys did last year.
It's not slippery slope.
It's not?
I know
Yeah, it would definitely be a slippery slope argument here. But what this is trying to illustrate is that chance event could have a major impact. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Okay. So, unpredictability. Okay, absolutely a part of history, okay? Let's wrap up by saying maybe history is a compromise of many factors. Maybe all of them are true. All of the causations are true. Maybe geography and great people and economics and chance are all the things that drive history. Now, that doesn't really help us in the sense that now it makes history more complicated, but at least we admit that it is in fact a complicated study. Okay, and you know what? Let's call it a class today. I can see you guys struggling with this today. We'll hold off on any activities. I will see you guys on Wednesday.